Well, that is what we're beginning today. You know, because everybody wonders, right? What will happen when I die? You know, is heaven real? And like that popular song, does heaven have a plan for me? And you know, it's a huge topic actually in our culture. All you have to do is scan the books or the movies or the cable channels, and you see all kinds of interest in the spiritual world right now, and even near-death experiences in heaven. And yet, while we're curious, to some degree, we're also in denial. People don't really want to think about death, even though there's a really high chance it's going to happen to you, right? There were three guys who were sitting around playing poker one night, and one of them said, "Hey, what do you want people to say at your funeral?" And the first guy said, "I want people to say I was a brilliant doctor who saved many lives." And the second guy said, "I want people to say that I was a devoted family man to my kids, to my wife." And the third guy said, "Really? I want people to say, look, he's moving." And believe it or not, that's what's happening more and more. That people are saying, look, he's moving. In fact, the Gallup poll and other studies estimate that 13 million Americans, or 1 out of 25 people, have had what is called a near-death experience, or NDE, where there was no heartbeat, no brain waves in some cases, and yet modern medicine brought them back. Now, there's nothing really that new about this. Jesus brought back Lazarus, brought back Jairus' daughter. But what these people say they experienced on the other side is really hard for some to believe. But if you're willing to keep an open mind to what modern medicine is actually showing us, it's showing us that life does not end. That this life is actually just the beginning of the real story, of the real life that's more exhilarating than anything you've ever imagined. And so for the next 6 weeks, we're going to look at what God has been telling us all along, and how what these people say actually matches what he's been telling us. And every week I'm going to interview very credible people who died and were resuscitated and had something to say about it. Doctor, college professor, commercial airline pilot, pastor, others right here in our church potentially. And we're going to hear, you know, from them and from the scriptures what we have to look forward to. You know, for me, 35 years ago, my father was dying of cancer. And I saw a book on the side, on his bedside table called Life Afterlife. It was the first book that coined the term near-death experience about these stories. And at that time, I didn't really believe, I didn't know what I believed. I didn't really believe in God or Jesus or the afterlife or any of that. The only thing I believed in was the next party. And I picked the book up, though, and I read it cover to cover that night, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like, this God stuff may be true. And it was the next year in a small group, kind of what we call life groups, in a home where I was able to ask my questions and doubt and wrestle with what the scripture said, and I came to faith. And since then, you know, I went to school at the University of Texas, studied engineering, and while I looked into what are reasons we have to believe this is true, and I found incredible historical evidence. And for those of you who aren't convinced yet, I want to encourage you to go on our website, gatewaychurch.com, and just click New here, and there's a button called Exploring Faith, and you can listen to some of that evidence. But I left my career in engineering years later to start Gateway to be a place where people could come as you are, even with doubts, even with questions and struggles like I had. Now, since then, I've also read close to 1,000 accounts of people who claim that they died, were resuscitated, and had something to say about it. And what I've come to believe is that it's actually what the scriptures already said. And that's why I wrote the book, Imagine Heaven. You know, if you're still skeptical, I hope you'll see in it that there is a lot of reason to believe that this is real and that you really need to take the time to check it out. And if you're already a Christian, I hope you see how real the life to come is, and that it actually is what we need to be planning for and saving for and sacrificing for and living for. Because it changes the way you live this life. It changes the way you love. It changes the way you treat people. So today I'm going to do kind of an overview of the book and of what we're going to be talking about in depth in the weeks to come. And I want to just say from the very beginning, I'm skeptical of any one story of people dying and coming back. And I think you should be too. Because some people, as you're going to hear throughout the weeks, they're interpreting an experience that's kind of like trying to describe to a two-dimensional world what three dimensions are like. And so everyone has to interpret. But when you put all these pictures together, and I've included about 120 of their stories in Imagine Heaven, you start to see that it really does coincide with what God has told us all along. And when you begin to imagine it, then it changes the way you view this life too for the better. So today, we're going to start to imagine it. So I want you to think about that. I want you to imagine that day that maybe you feared the most. That day when you draw your last breath. What's interesting is people report to their surprise, there wasn't fear. And they found themselves outside their body, looking down on their lifeless body, out of their body, but with a new body. And fully themselves. To their surprise, many of them said they couldn't even tell they were dead because they felt more alive than they had ever been in their lives. And people describe what they see and said it not scary, but invigorating. And what they described to skeptical cardiologists and oncologists and the doctors who revived them convinced many skeptical doctors the afterlife really does exist. Listen to how cardiologist Dr. Michael Sabom says what changed his mind. He said, before talking to Pete and scores like him, Sabom says, I didn't believe there was such a thing as a near-death experience. Pete told me he had left his body during this first cardiac arrest and had watched the resuscitation. When I asked him to tell me what exactly he saw, he described the resuscitation with such detail and accuracy, I could have later used the tape to teach physicians. Sabom says, these people like Pete Morton saw details of their resuscitation they could not otherwise have seen. One patient noticed the physician who failed to wear scuffs over his white patent leather shoes during open heart surgery. In many cases, I was able to confirm the patient's testimony with medical records and with the hospital staff. I talked to Dr. Sabom. And he said when he started to study these NDEs, he did to refute them. He said, I wanted to see if they would pass scientific muster. They did. And after 5 years of research, he published his findings in a book called Recollections of Death. Interestingly, he also published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. And a radiation oncologist, Dr. Jeff Long, read his findings in JAMA and said he found it hard to believe. But then one night he was at dinner with friends and he said Sheila mentioned a food allergy where one time she coded, her heart stopped beating. And because he had heard this, Dr. Long decided to probe. He said, did anything happen to you when you coded? He said, hesitantly, Sheila said, yes. I found myself at ceiling level, she said. I could see the EKG machine I was hooked to. The EKG was flatlined. The doctors and nurses were frantically trying to bring me back to life. The scene below was a near panic situation. But in contrast to the chaos below, I found a profound sense of peace. I was completely free of any pain. My consciousness drifted out of the operating room and moved to a nursing station. I immediately recognized that this was the nursing station on the floor where I'd been prior to my surgery. From my vantage point near the ceiling, I saw the nurses bustling about performing their daily duties. After I watched the nurses a while, a tunnel opened up. I was drawn into the tunnel. And I passed through the tunnel and I became aware of a bright light at the end of it. I felt peaceful. And after I passed through the tunnel, I found myself in this area of beautiful, mystical light. In front of me were several of my beloved relatives who had previously died. It was this joyous reunion. We embraced. I found myself with a mystical being of overwhelming love and compassion. Do you want to go back? He asked. I responded, I don't know, which is just like my old indecisive self at the time. After further discussion, I knew the choice to return to my physical body was mine. It was the most difficult decision. I was in a realm of overwhelming love. And in this realm, I knew I was truly home. Finally, I did return to my body. I woke up in the ICU over a day later with tubes and wires all over me. I could not talk about my profound experience. Well, since then, Dr. Long has scientifically studied thousands of accounts from around the world, which I explore many of them in Imagine Heaven and what they mean. But he concluded this: by studying thousands of detailed accounts of NDEers, I found evidence that led to this astonishing conclusion. NDEs provide such powerful scientific evidence that it's reasonable to accept the existence of an afterlife. And here's what convinced many skeptical doctors more that I talk about in the book, is that people report staying in the vicinity and seeing their lifeless body and what's going on and things that could be checked out afterwards. Like in The Lancet, another prestigious medical journal, they published this account of a patient who had a cardiac arrest, was not breathing, and was put into a coma. So at the time that a tube was being placed in the airway to ventilate the patient, it was noted he had upper dentures. The dentures were removed and placed in a crash cart drawer while the patient was deeply comatose. Over a week later, the patient reported having had an out-of-body experience when he died, and accurately described the room he was resuscitated in and the people present. Remarkably, he declared that his lost dentures could be found in the crash cart drawer. What convinced so many skeptical doctors were these verifiable details that these people who were clinically dead said they saw. And I point out studies done that show how accurate their observations were. Because see, when you die, you leave this body behind, but you still have a body, a spiritual body. Now that shouldn't totally shock us. First of all, the Bible's told us that for years. But secondly, science even tells us that every every cell in your skin dies and gets replaced about every 2 weeks. Did you know that? Your cells are continually dying and being replaced. You are not the same body you were 7 years ago. So then, yeah. Yes, but it's going to go the other way, which is even better. But think about that. So if your body, your cells are continually changing, then who are you? Well, the Bible's told us all along, you're more than a physical body. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul was a Jewish Pharisee who was killing Christians for claiming that Jesus was the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah, until on the Damascus road, he's headed to arrest Christians, and he encounters a man of light, of brilliant light. By the way, just like NDEer's account, or see, and we'll look more in that in the weeks to come, he realizes it's Jesus, and Jesus was who he claimed. But by the way, seeing is not believing. Paul still had to decide, even after seeing Jesus in this brilliant light, decide whether he would follow him. And that's the same for NDEers too. It doesn't take away their choice. But Paul goes on to start churches all across the Roman Empire. And in Acts chapter 14, it appears that Paul may have had a near-death experience when he got stoned in Lystra, in the city of Lystra. Stoned to death. I always have to clarify that here in Austin. So Paul, some of you are just getting it. Come on, stay with me. Acts chapter 14 says this: they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town, thinking he was dead. But as the believers gathered around him, he got up and went back into the town. Now listen to what Paul later says, I think, about that. 2 Corinthians 12. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. And that's what people say. It's like, I felt so alive and so me. You still feel like you have a body. But I do know I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words. Things no human is allowed to tell. And Paul later explains that when we die, we're still ourselves in bodies. It's like an upgrade. It's like, it gets better. So don't worry. And Paul talks about this. He says, our bodies are buried in brokenness, 1 Corinthians 15. But they are raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, but they'll be raised in strength. They're buried as natural human bodies, but they will be raised as spiritual bodies. And we'll talk more about what that's like next week. But what you need to know is you'll be yourself. In fact, you've never been yourself as much as you will be. And what people say is they were more alive than ever. People consistently say this. It's more real than what we experience now. Now, think about the impression you've had of heaven. And what I find, the impression most people have of heaven, it's pretty bad. It's like this kind of ethereal, less than tangible, misty, cloudy, boring existence, right? It's like the old Far Side cartoon. You ever see this where the two guys sitting on a cloud and they're kind of, swinging their feet on the edge of the cloud and one guy's whistling, the other guy said, man, I wish I'd thought to bring a magazine. Because we think it's boring. Or people think it's going to be like an endless church service. Look, that sounds bad to me, and I'm a pastor, all right? Because here's the deal. There is nothing, have you figured this out yet? There is nothing in this life that permanently satisfies you. I don't care how good it gets. Pretty soon it's like, what now, right? Do you know why that is? Because we weren't created for this life. This is just the birth canal. This is just the beginning of the real existence that we were created to live. That's what it says even in Hebrews 8:5. They serve in a system of worship that's only a copy, a shadow of the real one in heaven. Don Piper was pronounced dead for 90 minutes by EMS when an 18-wheeler ran over the top of his car. He said he didn't pass through a tunnel. He just, boom, was there in heaven or the entrance of heaven. And he said this. He said, as I looked around, I could hardly grasp the vivid, dazzling colors. Every hue and tone surpassed anything I had ever seen. With all the heightened awareness of my senses, I felt I had never seen, heard, or felt anything so real before. And Don will be here next week to talk more about that. But just imagine for a second that day that you feared most. Suddenly you come more alive than you've ever been. Not just 5 senses, but all kinds of new senses, and you're feeling things and experiencing things. It's so thrilling. You can't wait to go and explore the adventure of this wonderful place that you've now discovered. Enhanced vision. You can see up close. You can see miles away. New, vibrant colors you've never imagined before. And a light unlike anything you've ever imagined. And you know what's fascinating? Even blind people who die and are resuscitated, they see the same things. In fact, Vicky, who was born blind from birth, flatlined in a very bad car accident. And she said that she could see and had a hard time adjusting to visual perception. But she realized she was looking down at the doctors working on her body. She said, I finally recognized my wedding ring and my hair. Her hair was down all the way to her back, and she had a wedding ring with orange blossoms on it. And so she recognized them. And she said, and I thought, is this my body down there? Am I dead or what? And they were trying to frantically work on this thing that I discovered was my body. But I felt very detached from it, and I thought, I'm out of here. I can't get these people to listen to me. She said, as soon as I thought that, I went up through the ceiling as if it were nothing. And it was wonderful to be out there and free and not worry about bumping into anything. And I knew where I was going. And I heard the sound of wind chimes. It was the most incredible sound I can describe. Now, Vicky noticed that she was fully herself. She had a distinct form, arms, legs, all that. But she said something else as well. She said she went up through this dark enclosure. She said like a tube. She heard sublimely beautiful music that transitioned into praise to God. She reaches this opening and finds herself on grass with flowers and trees and a vast number of people surrounding her. She said in this place of tremendous light. And listen to how Vicky describes the light. The light was something you could feel as well as see. Everybody there was made of light. And I was made of light. And what the light conveyed was love. It was like love was everywhere. It was like love came from the grass, love came from the birds, love came from the trees. It was incredible, really beautiful. And I was overwhelmed by that experience because I couldn't really imagine what light was like. It's still a very emotional thing when I talk about this. Now here's what's amazing, because I talk about other blind people who see the same things that Vicky's describing. And they talk about light coming out of everything. Now, where would blind people ever hear that light comes out of stuff? Light doesn't come out of stuff on planet Earth. It gets shined on, right? But you may not realize it, but the Bible says that's what heaven's going to be like. But most people don't know that. Did you know that? So how do these blind people get that idea? And yet, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. I used to just think that was a metaphor. Maybe not so much. You know, it says in Revelation 21:23, John has this experience of heaven, and he writes about the city of God. He said, the city has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city. And the Lamb, Jesus, is its light. The nations will walk in its light, not by its light, in its light. Fascinating. In the Old Testament, an angel tells the prophet Daniel in Daniel 12, the dead will rise up, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting disgrace, and those who lead many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever. And Paul talks about a similar kind of thing. But Vicky and others describe this light coming out of everything, this life and love, vibrant colors, indescribable music, and time and travel of another dimension, like we've never thought about. In fact, Harvard neurosurgeon Eben Alexander thought that when your brain dies, your consciousness just goes out. And then he had his brain crash and had an experience like this. And here's what he says. In the worlds above this one, time simply doesn't behave as it does here. A moment can seem like a lifetime, and one or several lifetimes can seem like a moment. I don't think he realized he was quoting the Bible. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day, said Peter, Jesus' disciple. But here's the thing, if that seems, thinking about being a person of light, that seems weird or scary, don't worry. The thing people say more than ever is, I was home. I was where I belong. In fact, the biggest problem is people don't want to come back. And you're not going to be alone because heaven was made for relationship. Those who get a glimpse of heaven agree on one thing more than anything. Love is the point of it all. And Jesus said, you can sum up all the commands of the Bible by love God first and then let him teach you and me how to love one another as he loves us. That's it. So if that's the point of earth, why would we think that the God who wants us to love one another would rip loving relationship apart in heaven? Nothing could be farther from the truth. Marv Besteman, who was a bank president, died after surgery in the hospital in Michigan. And he recalls when he got there in the gates of heaven, or whatever you call it, I don't know exactly. I think it's a peek into heaven, but I don't know if it's the whole thing. In fact, we'll talk more about this, but many people said there was a barrier or a threshold or a boundary they couldn't go beyond. I think that's very important. They